All right, well, welcome everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Sarah Robbins, Chapter President of PRSA Sierra Nevada. We have a great panel ahead of us and we will have time for Q&A at the end. You will provide your questions in the chat and we will read them at the end. First, I wanted to share a couple of chapter updates with you. April is APR month. In celebration, our VP of Professional Development, Kathy Taylor, will be hosting a free virtual panel on April 29th. It'll be aimed at helping you make the decision to pursue your accreditation in public relations. And that information is on our website. You can visit that now and sign up. And the votes are in, very exciting. We have our results for the Silver Spike Awards. May 13th will be the return of our event. It will be virtual this year, but our event chairs are working very hard to recognize all of the hard and amazing work that has been done in the last year and a half. And with that, I'm pleased to get today's program started with a special message from First Lady Kathy Sisolak.
Hello, this is First Lady Kathy Sisolak. Thank you for inviting me to speak briefly at the start of this important webinar. This issue is close and dear to my heart, and I am sure it is yours as well. As many of you know, I am the daughter of immigrants, and my father was the first Chinese dealer on Fremont Street. I want to thank all those who are here today to discuss this important topic. You are here because you care, and together we can help one another find solutions and better address these challenges that our society faces. My heritage and my culture are an important part of my identity, and I firmly stand upon the belief that no one should ever be targeted or persecuted for their race, ethnicity, or the color of their skin. Attacks on the AAPI community have undoubtedly increased as research released by reporting forum Stop AAPI Hate revealed nearly 3,800 incidences were reported over the course of roughly a year during the pandemic. Many experts believe this is just a fraction of the true total. Now, as we ask ourselves what we can do as Nevadans in order to help address this issue in our state, a few suggestions have come to my attention. First, support the immediate needs of AAPI groups on the ground. AAPI groups in our communities are the go-to places of refuge and resources for our AAPI people in Nevada. We can show our support as a society by donating money, helping with translation services, and if you are capable, offer your support and legal assistance. Second, report the hate crime or incident. If it's a violent situation or somebody's safety is in danger, call 911 immediately. Hate crimes are underreported. Numerous Asian American community leaders have reminded us that reporting an incident you experienced or witnessed can help bring greater awareness and strengthens the chance a perpetrator will be prosecuted. Lastly, never stop raising your voices and encourage fellow community members to do the same. Ask the leaders to center the needs of affected communities, tackle systematic racism, and help address the needs of survivors. At the end of the day, we need to ensure each of us does our part and actively contribute to help address this issue. Thank you for convening this panel to discuss this important work. I look forward to continuing these conversations and making positive change in our communities as a result. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's event. Chrisie Yabu is the Vice President of PR at KPS3 and is a fourth-generation Japanese American. She grew up in San Francisco and first felt the calling to PR while watching a local news anchor named Wendy Tokuda, one of the first Japanese American women anchors in the West. She has more than 2 decades of experience in marketing communications and is an award-winning professional, recognized both locally and nationally for her work in the public relations field. Before I officially pass over the reins, I hope you all join me in congratulating Chrisie, as she will be the recipient of our Hall of Fame Award at this year's Silver Spikes.
Thanks, Sarah. And thank you to the panelists for joining me today. I really appreciate your thoughtful approach to this topic. First, we have Jon Osaki here. Jon is an award-winning filmmaker and youth advocate for the Japanese Community Youth Council, of which I am a proud alumni. He has directed and produced educational and documentary films, including Alternative Facts, The Lies of Executive Order 9066. Jon's a native San Franciscan, just like me, and has served as the executive director of JCYC since 1996. But I have known Jon much longer. I would say more than 40 years I have been in Jon's purview. He is one of my mentors. During Jon's tenure, JCYC has grown to become one of San Francisco's most successful youth organizations, annually serving more than 5,000 children and youth from all ethnic and socioeconomic backgrounds. Welcome, Jon. Thanks for joining us. Next is Anh Nguyen Gray. Anh is a public health editor for the KUNR news team here in town and has been with the station since 2014. Reporting on health policy, access to healthcare, and community health issues are Anh's primary interests. She also enjoys covering innovations in the prevention of disease and the promotion of wellness. Those stories include nutrition, evidence-based health initiatives, and medical breakthroughs. She is an alumna of Boston University School of Public Health and Teachers College, Columbia University. Very impressive, thanks, Anh. Khier Casino joins us from New Jersey and is the editor of NextShark, which is the largest online publication for Asian Americans. Prior to NextShark, he worked as a tech reporter for the New York Daily News. He starts at the Columbia University School of Journalism Graduate School in late summer 2021. Hi, Khier, thanks for joining us. And then finally, Kristin Oh is a public safety and breaking news reporter for the Reno Gazette Journal, where she aims to report on underserved communities and serve as a watchdog. She attended the University of Colorado Boulder and graduated with a BA in journalism with a minor in media production and is a first-generation Asian American. All right, so now on to the topic. Crimes targeting Asians and Asian Americans have risen dramatically since the pandemic, even as overall hate crimes have declined. Hate crimes against Asian Americans rose 149% from 2019 to 2020, even though hate crimes overall decreased 7% during the pandemic. Verbal assaults and violence are surging at an alarming rate. Every time I open NextShark, I have this gut feeling just of terror. This is provoking fear and anger in our community. And I think everyone here can attest to this in particular. Stop AAPI Hate, a group that tracks discrimination and xenophobia against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, received nearly 3,800 reports of hate incidences during the pandemic, but we believe that that's just a fraction of the actual incidents occurring. A series of violent crimes against Asians, including the fatal shooting of 8 people in Atlanta, massage parlors, and the brutal beating of the 65-year-old woman outside of a luxury apartment building in New York City while on her way to church, have caused major concern on social media and have prompted activists and experts to call for more to be done to address violence in our community. So I want to start. How are you guys processing these events? Anh, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Well, thank you, Chrissy, for organizing this event and bringing light to this topic. It's a very difficult topic, I think, for all of us, right? Especially being part of the Asian American community. And just hearing you read, I mean, we've been paying attention to the news, like all of this is something that we've heard, but just having you read that laundry list, it's just, you know, it's just reminds me of how serious this problem is. And in terms of processing it, you know, I've lived in the United States for more than 40 years. I came here as a Vietnamese refugee with my family. So the majority of my life has been spent in this country. And so I think anyone who's Asian has experienced some form of racism throughout their life, right? I think that's just part of the experience of living in this country. And then I remember when we talked about this panel, the one question you asked me was like, do you think that with the recent shooting in Atlanta, that this is an inflection point? And I kind of paused at that moment. And I've been thinking and processing, and back to the question of processing, is that it's made me reflect about my for decades here, and the experience that my parents have had, the experiences that my children are having, and what's going through this country, and it just comes with a lot of reading and a lot of conversations, and those conversations are really challenging.
Absolutely. Khier, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, NextShark has always been a virtual newsroom, and we just try to make sure we check on each other, whether it's through Slack or video calls like this one. And I think the only thing that has changed is the amount of news tips regarding these recent incidents. I mean, we've covered crimes happening to the API community even before the pandemic began. But recently, it's almost every day that something has happened. I think the breaking point for me was covering the Atlanta shootings. It was the same time I was accepted into Columbia, and I didn't really have time to react or celebrate right away because I had a breaking news article to get out. But my family was there to celebrate with me like a few days after. Another incident that you brought up, Chrissy, was the one that really hit close to home for me was the elderly Filipino woman who was kicked to the ground while walking to church in New York. My mom, she's a religious person and she goes to work every day in the city. So, I mean, she's tough like all Asian moms, but that really had me worried for her to be working every day in the city after that incident. So I guess a good support system with family and friends is really important. And I guess one last thing I would want to bring up is social media and how we use it constantly as part of our jobs. And honestly, if I didn't need social media for my job, I would be happy without it because there's so much going on top of everything else that at some point it does affect your mental health. Looking at these videos and often violent stories. So it's just good to kind of go off the grid sometimes after you're done working for the day.
Kristin, how are you dealing with these events?
It's a lot to process because, like Dave mentioned before, this happens almost daily. I was actually on Instagram before I joined this chat and I saw a headline from NextShark about another attack that happened, but I didn't really read into it. But all these attacks that are going viral on social media, they're happening to older Asian people. So I do have a lot of fear for my parents and my aunts and uncles, especially because, they're immigrants and they don't speak English as well. And, you just never know what's going to happen. And I'm from Colorado, which is majority, dominated by a white population. So you just never know what's going to happen. So there's always that fear in the back of my mind that something's going to happen to my parents.
Mm-hmm. And Jon, you're in the city, you're deep in the heart of San Francisco. How are you dealing with all of this?
Well, so as a third generation Japanese American, my father spent 4 years incarcerated during World War II in the Tule Lake Segregation Center. My mother spent 3 years incarcerated at the Gila River concentration camp in Arizona. And I think for me, I grew up hoping that my own children and the young people who work with at JCYC would not have to experience the same type of hate that my mother and father and all of my aunts and uncles and family members experienced in 1942. But unfortunately, as we can see, that is not the case. And I think it's a really tragic reminder that as Asian Americans, no matter how much we think we've made it in this country, really this, when a national emergency happens, whether it is a war or a pandemic, this country will turn on us in a dime, in a heartbeat, if it serves a political purpose. And I want to just say that I think we at this moment have to acknowledge that the partisan politics in this country have become toxic, and we are collateral damage of a lot of what is being said and thought throughout this country. And I don't want to spend this session talking in partisan terms, but I think we do have to talk about the accountability that the leaders of this country have to, quite frankly, prioritizing their own power and maintaining their elected seats over the safety of Asian Americans. And, you know, that's part of what we are going through right now. I think it's very, very unfortunate. You know, even here in California and San Francisco, we are seeing acts of hate in, you know, one of the most, you know, liberal areas in the country. And that's how infected, you know, this whole, you know, very, very sad and tragic situation has become. So, you know, it's very difficult for me to watch and to be a part of this, but I'm glad that we have a space like this to talk and to help people process and think through how do we move forward.
Yeah, and I echo that sentiment too, John, because like your family, my parents and grandparents were at Tulu Lake. My grandpa was at Gila River prior to that. And it takes me back to that time when the poster was posted about incarceration. And it's almost like rewinding 60 years and going backwards as far as the rhetoric is concerned, the propaganda that this has created. So I can only imagine what my grandfather was feeling at that time, because it feels very similar. My next question is about explanation of this model minority myth. It's a super complicated topic, but it's important because there's nuances in it. So what is it and how is it affecting the Asian community? An, do you want to take this one?
It is a very complicated and I think loaded terminology, because if you break it down, the model minority myth is, on the one hand, it's saying like, oh, look at how amazing you are, look at how much you have achieved. But if you look at it deeper, I think that the challenge with that is that it is reducing people to just a few characteristics, right? You're taking a group and you have stereotyped them to be a certain way. And I think that anytime there's that stereotyping, it's dangerous, because then you are not seeing the full scope of who people are. And we see that with not just Asians, but other groups, racial and ethnic minority groups, is that certain characteristics have been attributed to them. And so when you only see those characteristics, you don't see all the other contributions and the challenges that come along with it. And in reality, you know, Asian Americans are not, even though with all the racial and ethnic minority groups, we have higher income compared to other groups. Within the Asian American group, there's a lot of income disparities. And so I think what that does is then it also diminishes some of the pain and suffering that some people in the Asian American community are experiencing.
John, what do you have to add to that one?
Well, I think this is an important issue to unpack. You know, the model minority myth really has its origins all the way back. What we were just talking about was after World War II. For Japanese Americans, it was an act of survival to put your head down, to do everything you could to assimilate and be good Americans. And it really was the way in which many families prioritize raising their children in order to help them get over the stigma that occurred during the war. And, you know, I think that, you know, Japanese Americans were actually initially the poster child for the model minority myth. And it came about because, you know, really they had very few options. So a lot of people don't talk about the fact that after World War II, Japanese Americans, many were homeless. Like, for example, my father and other Japanese Americans, when they were released from the concentration camps, they were given a bus ticket and $25. And that is after losing almost all of their possessions. And so just out of sheer survival, they had to do everything they could to assimilate, because, you know, part of the rhetoric during the war, and this seems ridiculous now, but it was that Japanese Americans were unassimilable. into American society. And so it forced Japanese Americans to prove how American they were. But unfortunately, what happened as we moved into the 1960s is that the solidarity and the power that was starting to develop between Asian and Black and Latinx communities was getting too powerful for many people in this country. And so the model minority myth was then used and weaponized to create a wedge between Asians and Black Americans. And it was, the narrative was deliberately altered to focus on Asian Americans as the example of a group that if you just work hard enough, you can make it in America. And that was used to really push back against a lot of the movement that occurred during the civil rights movements during the 1960s. So it's really unfortunate that, frankly, Asian Americans have been used in many ways in that respect. And I think it's something we have to be very aware of today as we're talking about race and we're talking about attacks, not just on our communities, but on other communities as well.
I used to ask my dad, when you would get on the bus, did you sit at the front with the white people or did you sit at the back with the Black people? And he would say, wherever there was a seat. So that's the kind of attitude that our generations before us took. It was about keeping your dignity, but also keeping your mouth shut because you wanted to assimilate and you wanted your kids to assimilate right there with you. On to the next question. How do you think the media is responding? What do they need to do to go deeper on the subject? Kristin, what do you think?
I think the important thing here is to pay attention to local newspapers and local journalists because with what happened with the shooting in Atlanta, the local newspapers there are the ones who are honoring those who had died and they're writing profiles on them. And another example I'm thinking of is the shooting in Boulder. I went to college there, so I have a lot of reporter friends who are working in Denver and Boulder, and they're the ones who are keeping tab on the court case and writing profiles on the victim and keeping track of everything. And that's not necessarily getting the attention of national news. So just paying attention and supporting local journalists, I think, is really important. I always remind myself that if something like that were to happen here, then it would be our responsibility to make sure that, we're keeping, the party who attacked them accountable for their actions and honoring those who died or were injured. So that's just my perspective from working with the RGJ. It's to just honor those and celebrate the lives lost.
Khier, you're at the eye of the storm and you report on this every day. What is mainstream media not doing right? And what do you think they need to go deeper on?
Yeah, I totally agree with Kristin. Local reporting is so important, especially for these kinds of stories. And there is a distinction between local and online media versus mainstream media. Online media like NextShark, we've covered these incidents since February 2020. We've published over 750 stories related to COVID-19 affecting Asian communities, mostly here in the US, Canada, and Australia. And I would say about half of those are related to discrimination, racism, and harassment on Asian individuals. For a year, I would say mainstream media has largely ignored these attacks, the outrage, the fears, and the deaths. And it's only recently that I've seen them cover these kinds of stories. And I would say society's perspective of Asian Americans would play a part in how important Asian American issues have been. AAPI issues, they're also largely ignored until it was too large to dismiss. And I think one thing we need to do better in the media is to bring in diversity, inclusion in the mainstream media.
The use of racial and ethnic terms to describe the coronavirus is an important contributor to all of this. CNN reports the majority of the complaints, about 68%, have involved verbal harassment. So I do want to go back to Jon and talk a little bit more about the deep history invoked by patriotism. In your mind, how does language play a part? How does rhetoric, propaganda play a part, even now in our current administration?
Well, and I don't have to tell the people on this panel this, but I think because we all know that, you know, this country has a really long history of taking advantage of Asian labor, because historically, in, you know, throughout periods of time in this country, it was cheap, it was accessible, but unfortunately, as soon as there was not a need for us in this country anymore, this country turned its back on us. It used rhetoric, it used legal means to basically get rid of us. And that was, you know, that's been kind of the legacy of Asian Americans in this country. And, you know, more recently we have been tolerated as groups, but you know, I think it's very obvious to everybody here that, you know, when the pandemic broke out, in order to try to minimize his accountability for the pandemic, the Trump administration launched a very deliberate strategy to bash China, right, and to blame an Asian country for the virus. And of course, we know Trump is now gone, but I think we have to spend a little bit of time talking about House Resolution 906, which was introduced by Representative Grace Meng from New York. And this was just a very simple resolution to demonstrate support for the Asian community and to condemn anti-Asian violence. And this was introduced back in September. And I have to say, and again, I'm not here to talk partisan politics, but I am here to talk about the facts. And the fact is that 164 congressional representatives out of 178 Republicans voted against this measure that had no resources attached to it. There was no money. It was just simply an act of solidarity, but it was attacked for being anti-Trump and something that could hurt his chances for re-election. So let's think about that for a second. A resolution to support Asian Americans was categorically, you know, with only 14 exceptions, was denounced by one of our political parties in this country because it was considered something that was not in support of their agenda. And I think, to me, that is just incredibly sad. And I think that part of what we have to talk about is in this country is there has to be accountability for taking those types of positions. And, you know, Trump is gone. We don't have to deal with him anymore. But those congressional representatives who voted against a resolution in support of Asian Americans are still in their elected seats. And I just want to take a really quick second to share, because we're talking about words here. So Republican Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy from my state of California had this to say about the bill. He called it a, quote, waste of time. And he said, at the heart of this resolution is the absurd notion that referring to the virus as a Wuhan virus or a China virus is the same as contributing to violence against Asian Americans. And I don't even know what to say about that other than the blatant denial. And, you know, I don't know how many people have circled back to him on that statement. I don't know how much the press has covered that, but those are the types of things that we have to hold our elected leaders accountable for, because I can guarantee you 100% that is contributing to a lot of the violence that is taking place in this country right now, because it's a very well-known political tactic to use something called effective frequency. This is something that advertisers are very, very familiar with, and that is if you create very simple messages and you repeat them enough times, they get into people's heads. They get into people's subconscious. Doesn't matter what political party you're part of, right? It gets into your thinking, and we know this from the advertisements that we can rattle off in our heads without even thinking about it. This is a proven tactic, and it's something that politicians have used very effectively. And so this whole process, right, of coming up with terminology like the Kung flu, right, the Wuhan virus, that was very deliberate, that was very intentional, and it was very effective. And we have to hold the people accountable who have enabled these types of strategies.
Anyone else want to add to this?
I'll jump in. I just wanted to touch base a little bit on what Jon said earlier about going back a little bit to the beginning with the model minority myth. I think what's interesting about the model minority myth is that it also reduces groups of people to, if they're valuable based on their economic contribution. And I think that groups of people bring some different things to the table and many things to the table. And I think that we've seen that throughout history, which is that, as a nation, you see groups of people treated based on socioeconomic contributions, whether it was in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act was, minimizing Chinese laborers to this country. And then, you see it in the 80s with the rise of Japanese automakers and the killing of Vincent Chin because he was assumed to be Japanese in Michigan. And so we've seen that repeated throughout history. And what happened with the pandemic is that with the rising anxiety over public health scares and then also economic anxiety, is that, it's like what Jon said, it's like using language that promotes fear and promotes the other, when in actuality, you look at Asian Americans as a group in this country, we're so diverse, coming from, 20 different countries with different histories and culture. And some Asian Americans have been here for generations, but it's to promote that otherness, to make it about an us versus them. And I think that that's where the rhetoric becomes very dangerous. And we've seen that play out over the last.
Let's talk about this fear and how it's being weaponized towards Asians. I want to dive a little deeper into that one. Khier, what are your thoughts on that?
Yep. So as An and Jon have already explained, this kind of rhetoric of Chinese virus is the modern day strategy for yellow peril. And I don't want to give a history lesson because I don't want to bore the audience, but we see propaganda that pits one ethnicity, nationality against a base to spread terror and fear to accomplish some agenda. And I think it's the tactic and mentality of white supremacy. We saw it happen back in the 1800s, as An said, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Yellow Peril, Yellow Terror, the Chinese Massacre in LA. We've also seen this, as Jon pointed out, in World War II with the Japanese concentration camps, and for other minority groups when it served the agenda of white supremacy. For example, Blacks moving in to ruin your neighborhoods, Mexicans coming to steal your jobs, and that the idea that a Muslim or almost any brown person was labeled as a terrorist because of 9/11, or even Indian Sikhs were targeted out of ignorance. So how do we fight it? I would say counter it in the media with minority voices, a diversity of narratives, because news in America, I would say, is white-centric. So, yeah.
Did you want to add to this one? Anything more?
I think that basically what Khier has said is just to broaden where we get our information and news and to talk to people. I think the more you hear people's stories, the more you understand. And I think that that's, something that we're all trying to do in terms of in the media, whether it's public relations or journalism, that we're trying to get diverse voices out there.
Anyone else on this one? All right. So as I alluded to earlier, telling our stories isn't something that comes necessarily naturally to us. I think our generations before us hardly talked at all, if I can generalize. I mean, I would ask my grandpa, tell me about camp. What happened? What did you do? And he would just give me very little information. I think partly because it was tied to embarrassment, but also partly because he was so upset at the situation that he couldn't talk about it. So how do we ensure that our stories are told? I mean, and more people are coming out on social media these days, which is great to see, but it's really been, in my opinion, quite silent. So what do we do as journalists, as PR professionals to be more proactive? Khier, want to take that one?
So as you said, in Asian American culture, we're always not sharing problems and not wanting to be a burden to other people, not wanting to be in the spotlight. To ensure that our voices are heard, I think we need to create new platforms for sharing information specific to ethnic Asian communities, produced by Asian ethnic minorities. And this has always been the purpose of NextShark. And yes, we've recently covered more of the violence that's been going on in our communities, but we also highlight achievements, culture, identity, and other issues. And I would say journalism is evolving in that way, to tell stories in a new way. Fact checking has always been a problem as well, but new social media allows for that kind of diversity. And I would also say that traditional journalism as it stands right now is incapable of facilitating that kind of diversity, I think. So we need more journalists of color to tell and share their stories.
Aside from NextShark, is there any other outlet that you recommend people following?
Yeah, Asian American News, at smnews.com. They also cover some of the stuff we've covered. Also, Reappropriate is a feminist Asian blog. I'll be on another panel with the editor who runs that on Saturday. Yeah, a lot of local news media as well. ABC News, Dion Lim and Saifan Kim in New York City have been doing a great job.
Do you want to add to that one?
Well, I'd recommend reading more from writers, people of color. Just before this panel, when we were all chatting, I was recommending the book Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong. And she writes, it's a very timely book. It's called Minor Feelings, an Asian American Reckoning. And so she writes about the history of racism against Asian people in the United States. And that was, very illuminating. Who I follow on social media that I think has been a wonderful voice for Vietnamese Americans, but for Asian Americans in general, is Pulitzer Prize winning author Viet Thanh Nguyen. And what I've been noticing after 40 years of living in this country and just seeing, racism, change and form and mold, is that I do see a rise in Asian American voices. And to me, that's very positive and very exciting as well. And I was reading an article recently in The Atlantic, and it was an interview with Kathy Park Hong, and she's emerging as this Asian American activist voice. And she said, Asian Americans, for some, it's more challenging to identify as Asian American as an identity, because as I said earlier, we're such a diverse group, and it's so encompassing of so many cultures and languages and histories. But she suggested perhaps viewing it as a coalition. And to me, I really thought about that for quite some time and what that meant. And for me, it's just a way for us to come together with some shared experiences. And even though our histories may be different, the problem with racism is it reduces us to not who we are individually, right? So people who are racist will see us as one. So it doesn't matter if you're Japanese or Vietnamese or Korean or Chinese. Racism against Asian, they'll just see you as one stereotypical group. And so that to me was something that I want to think about more and read about more, because I think that to me that felt very powerful, is that, you still have your own identity in terms of your culture and your experience, but as a coalition, I think that, there's a lot to be said about the power in numbers. And I think that's what the Asian American community could use more of.
I appreciate that answer. People need to lean in and volunteer to participate in the dialogue around public safety in our communities, especially. How do we build these coalitions to help stop racism? Kristin?
I think the main thing is to not be a bystander. A lot of these instances where people were attacked, they were caught on cell phone videos. So I think the big thing is, like, if you see someone being attacked and you think they're gonna die, just don't stand around with your cell phone in the air. Call 911 and help, and just be active in stopping any violence that you see. I think that's a big thing. And as a public safety reporter, a lot of my sourcing, especially since I've been stuck in my apartment due to the pandemic, a lot of my sourcing has come from social media and police reports. So just to just be aware that sometimes reporters, they rely on social media platforms to report on it, so that more people can be aware that this is happening in their community. If you see it, just speak out. And as a reporter, my job is to just not bring any harm to the community. If someone wants to be anonymous for fear of retaliation, I'm going to respect that. I'm not going to push you to just put your name out there just because I'm trying to be dramatic or anything. So from a reporter's perspective, it's just about respecting the community that you serve, and just keeping your eye out on social media platforms everywhere, just because especially with my generation, social media is the way everybody communicates. You're not always talking to people all the time, so you're just keeping an eye out everywhere, keeping an ear out, looking for stories, and just supporting one another. Like I said, social media is everywhere, so I have friends in Colorado and Virginia and Korea, and if they're going through something, I'm always quick to respond, just because that's the way that we keep in touch and support one another.
Jon?
Well, I think with this issue, and I wanted to follow up on something that Anh talked about, is that part of the challenge we have in this country is not only are many people in this country unwilling to distinguish between Asian American groups, but they're unwilling to distinguish between Asian Americans and Asian nationals. And that is where when this country starts to direct its animosity towards a foreign Asian government or a country, there has to be dialogue and an understanding that it does affect Asian Americans. Okay, it does come back on us. As much as people want to say, oh, well, that's different, it doesn't affect people in this country, we're seeing it right in front of our eyes right now. And I think we have to continue to talk about that every time you bash an Asian country, that there are implications, right, for our community. And I think that because we experience that, in terms of building coalitions, we have to be extra sensitive to not do the same to other communities. Like, I know that part of the rhetoric I heard within our own communities early on is when some of the attacks were towards Asians were by Black Americans. There was starting to be, and I could hear it, and I think we have to acknowledge it, that there was starting to be rhetoric about, oh, you know, this is starting to become a Black on Asian thing. And I think we have to be extremely articulate about that. And I think as Asian Americans, most have done a really good job to acknowledge that those are individuals, and that we cannot generalize that to entire groups of people. And because, you know, I can tell you, because I was just in a meeting yesterday with a whole, you know, Zoom room full of Black Americans who want to help to address violence against Asian Americans. And I think that that is where that's where the opportunity is to build coalitions. There are members of other communities who are just as horrified seeing what's happening in this country right now, who want to be allies to us. And I think that it's you know, a really important opportunity for us to reach out to them. I've had groups contacting me constantly to see how they can be allies, how they can be supporters of the Asian American community. And I think it's really, you know, this is an opportunity for us to build broader based coalitions, to not just work on this issue, but to work on other issues that can, you know, advance our concerns in this country. So I think that there are a lot of groups who want to be helpful and supportive in this process. And I think we have to really, you know, seize this opportunity to take advantage of that.
It just reminds me of the scenario with Alexi McCann and her firing the day after the Atlanta shootings. And this was the editor of Teen Vogue. And she's a woman of color, but the pressure was on. I mean, after that happened, for her tweets. And it just occurred to me that the shallow diversity topic is happening. And I just wanted your comments on, and Jon, on that particular situation, or situations similar to that. What's going on here?
Well, I think, and you know, it's an overused phrase, but you know, words do matter. And I think that we have to acknowledge that there is racist behavior within every community, right? There is no community that is immune from that. And so what I think is, and unfortunately, and I do want to make sure I say this, is that it has been acceptable to be racist towards Asians forever. I mean, I think that that has to be said. Like, it has been okay to ridicule, to make jokes, to make comments that would never be acceptable towards other groups, but it's been acceptable towards Asians. And I think this is a moment in time when our community is starting to say, no, that is not acceptable. It's not okay to be racist towards one group and not other groups. So I think that, you know, we have to acknowledge that there is racism within our own communities, within other communities, and again, I'm going to go to this point is we have to make sure we treat those people as individuals. And I also want to go back to my earlier point, though, that there does have to be a level of accountability. You know, people have to, you know, if they're going to put words out there in social media and other platforms, you know, they have to understand that they should be held accountable for them. And it's unfortunate that it cost somebody their job in this situation, but, you know, it's really important. And I want to say that I want to be very specific in how I say this, is that, you know, in this country, you cannot call out somebody else's racist behavior and then not be accountable for your own. And I think that's something that we have to be willing to talk about. And, you know, again, it's unfortunate that this person lost their job, but, you know, I think as Asian American communities, one of the things I wanted to say is that I think we have to commit to being good allies to other communities, right? We cannot just ask for help and go to them when we're under attack. And because I do think that we have to be very careful that we do not perpetuate the model minority myth ourselves. And, you know, just to be perfectly honest, that does happen, right? There are Asian Americans who feel like, well, I've made it, and oh, that's their problem, and I'm good. I have all, and the truth is that we have had a certain level of privilege. It's this weird dynamic, right? Because we have had certain opportunities that other communities haven't because of this this model minority myth. And I think we have to be very aware of that, and we have to make sure that we don't perpetuate it in a way where it's going to be divisive with other communities, because the truth of the matter is that if we can work in solidarity with other communities, it is going to give us so much more power to push back against systemic racism. And that is the bottom line. And we can't pick and choose when we do it, when it's convenient, when we're under attack. We have to prioritize it as communities. And that's one of the things that we've done in my organization, JCYC, and something that I think when we talk about these issues and we start to talk about solutions, that is one of the solutions.
I'm going to get to the last question because we're short on time here a little bit. So to wrap this up, how can journalists and PR professionals be more educated, more aware? What can be done at our level, nationally? What could we be doing more of? I'm going to start with Khier.
Yep. Just expanding on what Jon said, diversity is one of the only ways, but also tying this with Jon, we have to learn from other communities of color by supporting them. Supporting another minority is about consistency. And when you're fighting for one community, you're fighting for the whole community. And on a local level, spreading more awareness to continue to cover these stories. And these protests that have been happening throughout the country these past few weeks are also really important because it brings the whole community together. Yeah, that's it.
In terms of journalism, I think one thing that newsrooms can do is to seek out different types of stories. I think it's a challenge in journalism that we tend to repeat the same stories that other outlets are sharing. It's part in because of the news cycle. So you tend to write and present stories that's in the news. But I think that we have to challenge ourselves to do a little bit more than that and to seek out the voices and perspectives of a diverse group of people and look at different angles and not wait for something terrible to happen to then start seeking and reaching out to that community. I think that's, one thing that we could do. And I think that that is a challenge for newsrooms, especially smaller ones. And we know that within the industry, it's been tough with budget cuts and whatnot. But I think that that's an examination that as an industry we need to do, is to make sure that the newsroom is diverse and even more so, the stories that we are telling are diverse.
Kristin, anything to add there?
Basically what they said earlier, just supporting local journalists, supporting and advocating for diverse newsrooms, just because, people who experience different backgrounds and stuff, they know more about the community than, say, a straight white guy who's just heard about it on Twitter. So just having that insight really helps with reporting on diverse and underrepresented communities. And just speaking personally, I think that RGJ has done a great job of supporting its reporters, like in general with the pandemic. In college, I was told that I would be overworked and underpaid. But being in the RGJ team, it's not like that at all. And I was honestly really surprised that my editors supported my well-being, just because that's not what I was expecting at all going into this industry. So I'm grateful for them, and I'm grateful for all the other mentors I've had who were Asian American and advocated for me to get a paid internship, just because they knew as a woman of color I'd be less likely to get move up the chain just because of my background. I couldn't afford unpaid internships, so I had to work 3 jobs just to take care of myself. So I'm really grateful for the mentors that I had in college who supported that.
And then John, do you have anything to button this up with?
Just, I would encourage members of the media to make sure that we continue to hold people accountable for the positions that they take, for the words that they use, for the bills that they vote on, because I think that, you know, we have to, you know, one of the biggest tragedies with the incarceration of my mother and father and Chrissy's grandmothers and grandfathers is that no one was ever held accountable for locking up an entire racial group. And I think we have to make sure that this country maintains accountability for Asian Americans in this country. And I would encourage you all to really counter the divisive narrative that is so toxic in this country right now. That's it.
So it looks like we do have one question from Jamie. How do we encourage more organizations to use their collective voice for positive change? I see most organizations hesitate to engage in these conversations publicly for fear of harm for their brand.
Well, so I'll just share. So my organization, the Japanese Community Youth Council, we're based here in San Francisco, Japantown. And we decided in response to the Black Lives Matter movement to rebrand one of our main fundraisers to, we annually host an Aloha Run. And this past year, we reframed it to the Aloha Run for Black Lives. And we donated all the proceeds of that event to two organizations that serve the Black community. And it ended up being one of our most successful fundraisers ever. So in our case, it did not hurt our brand at all. And I think it very much promoted our desire to promote allyship, to promote solidarity, so that in this moment, when we now come under attack, there are those same groups that we worked with in the Black community are now coming to our support and are showing solidarity with us. And I think, to me, again, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but I think that really is one of the solutions, is to support other communities, other groups, find space for them in terms of the work that you're doing, because then that presents an opportunity for them to return it.
Looks like one more question just popped in from Ruth. As the publicist advising clients, I am super cautious about being tone deaf. Any mistakes those of us in PR make, I have been offering clients as resources to media openly, but not in a pushy way. Any guidance there?
I don't know if I have any guidance there, but the one thing that I can add to is that I think that we're all consumers. We consume so many different products, entertainment, news. I think that just as consumers, we should demand more. We should demand more from the books we read. We should demand more from the movies we watch. And that just means, you know, are you watching a movie that reduces certain groups to just some stereotypical behaviors? Or do you listen to music that does that? And I think in terms of PR, is here, I'll give an example. So a few weeks ago, as a family, we were looking for a movie to watch. And my son, who's 13, had read these series of books called Maze Runner. And I'm not familiar with the story. And he said, oh, it's a dystopian. And so I was really tired, really sleepy, sitting on the sofa, watching it as a family. And I was kind of dozing off. But then all of a sudden, you know, half paying attention, one of the lead characters was a character named Min Ho, and he was an Asian character, but it had nothing to do with him being Asian. He was just this, you know, strong character who played a big role. And that is so rare as an Asian person to see, like Asians being portrayed in a positive light, that's strong, that's interesting, that's not about them, you know, being some tech guy or some doctor. Not that those things are bad, but it's the stereotypes, right? So I think in PR or any industry is just to examine, like when you associate a group, are you associating them with like a broad range of diverse characteristics? Or are you reducing them to the few that has been perpetuated throughout history and throughout society? And so to me, that was very exciting. We talked about it after, about how like there was this character that was one of the main characters, and his character had nothing to do with his race, but just about what he was just contributing to the storyline. And I hope to see more of that, you know, as a consumer, as a parent. I think that that's important for us to make sure that that representation is not just in, you know, a few things, but just throughout our lived experience.
Thank you. I think that about wraps it up. Sarah Robbins, I don't know if you want to come back on or if you're good. Okay, there you go.
I just wanted, on behalf of all of our attendees today, to thank you guys so much for your time. It's certainly an important conversation for us to have, and I hope that everyone here had something to take away from it, and I believe that we do. So thank you very much. And that's a wrap. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.